Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Fantasy Friday. So, last week we were reading The Tiger and the Wolf by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and we learned that Maniye was going to run away with the snake, Hesprec essenskis. So, let's see how that turns out for them in chapters 7 and 8. Here we go. For the people of the crown of the world, fall meant a time of sacrifice. Winters came hard enough to kill experienced wildsmen as well as just the old and the young. If a tribe had miscalculated or had suffered a poor year, or if vermin got at the stores, then winter was a killing time. None knew it more than the wolf, and those that died in winter were the wolf's due. Offering sacrifice as the nights grew long might persuade the wolf to act as messenger to the greater powers of storm and snow and cold, and thus persuade them to stay their hands. Such intervention could only make the difference between a winter that took only a few of the weak and one that took all but the strongest. Journeying with Hesprec Essenskis was not easy, many had discovered. It was not like traveling with some sorcerer priest of the mysterious south. It was like traveling with an old, old man, and one with far too many quirks that slowed them down. For a start, and while it was still dark, their best chance to put distance between themselves and Akrit's hall, he had called a halt, lurching into his human form and shivering in the thin robe they had left him, out of all his belongings. She had been forced to step likewise and delve in her pack for what little she had brought for him, soft hide shoes that would surely not last long before wearing through, an old sheepskin jacket, much mended, and a very thin woolen cloak. He struggled into them all gratefully. The first spots of rain were lancing down from the lowering clouds above, and she had to watch as he sat and fought with the shoes, forcing his two big feet into them, then fumbling with the bindings. And all the while, their time was wasting, and they were still close enough that she felt tethered to the winter runners and her home. About that time, Maniye realized that she had not really been heading anywhere in particular. In fact, she had been taking them north, into friendless climes where the weather would get no kinder. What had drawn her there was the tree line. The cover of the woods lay closest in that direction, for the uneven landscape made felling difficult. Now she would have to pretend that was her plan, or else lose what little faith the snake priest might have in her. It made some sense. Get into the shadow of the trees, then curve east, because she was heading for... You said the horsemen would listen to you. She frowned. What are you doing? The old man had torn up the hem of his thin robe, exposing his bony ankles, and was binding the ripped cloth about his bald head with meticulous care. Showing due deference, he told her, and he was certainly taking his time about it, no matter how his hands trembled in the cold, or how blue his lips were. That was the first time she wondered if he might just die on her, if she would leave his emaciated corpse behind her, not enough meat on him for a coyote's belly. I don't know what you mean, she said flatly. It is our way, he told her. The horsemen, will they do what you ask? He had nothing to barter with, but she was desperate. If he had told her that he could magic them to obey his will, she would have believed him readily. The Horse Society, yes, they might, he agreed, closing his pale eyes. If I can promise them enough profit in the south, they might. And and you can get them to take us away from here? His eyes flicked open. I am not ready to leave. I don't care. My Stone River will be searching every span of Winter Runner land for us. I came here with a purpose, he protested mildly. Then you have failed in your purpose, she snapped, scowling down at him as he sat on a stone and fiddled with the bindings about his brow. I freed you so I could help you. so you can help me. Is it so? At last his hands were still. Indeed, all of him was still. A snake that might strike at any moment, if only it had teeth. Yes, it is so, she retorted, mimicking his mumbled speech. And I swear that, if you betray me right now, you will not take me to the horse and beg their aid to get away from my people, then I will abandon you. I will leave you for the cold or for the wolf, whichever finds you first. Do you even know where you want to go? He asked her, still calmly, but the words stung. Yes, And now she must name somewhere, but she did not know where. Her mother's people. But she found that she was almost as afraid of that idea as of going back to the Winter Runners. She had no image of her mother, no connection at all to them save her tiger soul, and she could not even say for sure that she would possess that for much longer. Perhaps the wolf inside her would overcome it soon, maybe even before the end of winter. And then, where would she be after that? What about south? She asked faintly. Your south. You have no idea what that is, nor how far away, nor what you might do if you should find yourself there. The weight of those words seemed to exhaust him. Take me where I ask, or... I know, he sighed. Let us find the horse society. He plainly insisted on the formal title. However, it was hard for him to say. Let us see what my little stock of influence may buy. He stood up, wincing. Go, lead on. She stepped to her wolf and ran for the tree line, because the rain was beginning to turn from a few light spots to something fiercer. All the better to hide our scent, she tried to tell herself, but the sheer misery of having to be out in such a downpour outweighed any such advantages. Whenever she turned, he was even further behind. Sometimes he was a man, stumbling along in her wake. Sometimes she had to hunt back to find the snake winding its laborious way across the uneven ground, half lost amid the grass. It seemed to take forever for him to reach the trees. You need to move faster, she told him, when he finally arrived and stepped into his gaunt, bony human body. Is it so? He got out. As man or as snake, you can't just hobble along like that. They'll catch us easily. It had all seemed such a good idea before. She had envisaged a swift flight across the nighttime country, greeting the dawn somewhere far away from Akrit's hall. She had not considered how old he was, how pale and ill-looking. He looked like something sent by fate to slow her down so that her father's hunters would be able to amble along her trail and find her standing over the old man's frozen corpse. She had never seen someone so ill-suited for travel. How did you even get so far from your home? She demanded, almost in tears. How did you not die before I ever saw you? Warmer clothes and setting my own pace, he replied tightly. If you will leave me now. I cannot go faster. I cannot get warm. You'll die here. It seems likely. He shuddered. Then his head jerked up, his eyes wide and fixed on her. Or perhaps you will trust me. She regarded him cautiously. Trust you how? Your little pack that your wolf can carry. Let me ride there between your shoulders, girl. I will weigh so little, and I will be warm. There was a dreadful longing in his voice. The thought made her squirm. You, you want to ride me like a beast? Like a horse? We must be swift. You are swift on 4 feet, as I will never be. But she remembered his serpent form. Slender, yes, but surely too large to coil itself into her small bag. You won't. I can step into a shape as thick around as a strong man's thigh, or slender as a whip, he told her. We are not so rigid as you, where I am from. His expression was naked, stripped of the wise humor he had pretended to in the open pit. Please, if we are to move on, or leave me. She recalled that he would not have been fed in the pit, growing weaker and weaker because the wolf would not care, when he ate the old man's soul, how thin the sacrificed body had been. Perhaps Hesprec Essenskis had been fit to wander at his snail's pace across the crown of the world, wearing snug clothes and relying on the hospitality of strangers. Now, though, he was at his lowest ebb, with neither strength nor wit enough to save himself. His life was in her hands, just as it had been when she came to cut him loose. And yet she needed his intervention with the horse if she was ever to get far enough from her father to be free. She had abandoned her kin and thrown herself on the world's mercy, so perhaps mercy was what she should know. Step, she told him. Step and climb into my pack if you can. I cannot bite, he told her, misinterpreting the pause. You need not worry. Old man, I do not fear you. To her surprise, that brought a thin smile. Brave child, he whispered, and then he was gone, gathering his clothes close to him and stepping down into something ribbon thin, a patterned snake perhaps half as long as she was tall. Even then she thought he must be too bulky to do what he had claimed, but when she opened the bag he slid into it, and on into it, feeding each hand's breadth of his slender body further in until the delicate line of his tail had vanished inside, and he was gone completely from her sight. She picked up the bag, feeling his unfamiliar weight, and feeling strange to know that the man she had been speaking to was now entirely tucked within. The thought was an uncomfortable one. She felt that somehow she was giving him power over her, for all that he had put himself entirely into her hands. When she first felt him move sluggishly within the bag, she almost dropped it. It took her 3 tries before she could secure the bulky pack on her back. Then she stepped to her wolf form and contorted her jaws until she could draw the strings tight, still feeling that unwelcome and unfamiliar weight. It was all too easy to imagine the thin lash of his body drawing itself about her neck, strangling her slowly to death, no matter what shape she might try to fight him in. Yes, such an action on his part would make no sense, and yet he was a foreigner, and a priest of a foreign god-spirit, so how could she trust him? None of her own people's stories about Snake were happy ones. But he had called her brave child, and she must be brave. Forcing down her qualms, she set off into the woods, passing swiftly as a wolf walks, hearing the rain beat on the overhanging needles above and drip all about her, scenting the complex book of the forest and its myriad denizens that was written afresh each night and blotted out by the raindrops. Fasting and drinking were a powerful combination. In the pre-dawn, there were only a handful up and out in the rain to witness what Maniye had done. At first, neither Akrit nor Kalameshli had made the connection. The priest had been furious that his prisoner had somehow escaped, storming back and forth and beating the 2 luckless sentries mercilessly with his flint-studded staff. Yes, their job had been pure formality, because no sacrifice had ever made it out of the pit before. But, still, theirs were the eyes, and they were both responsible. He stopped only when he had clubbed them both to the ground and broken one's arm. By that time, half the tribe had been awakened, but few felt much like venturing outside. Kalameshli had stood there with the rain streaking the half-done paint on his face, the start of his preparations for the day's festivities and ritual. By that time, someone had roused Akrit, who could still drink all night and yet be up with the dawn. The chief of the winter runners stormed over, wrapped in a bearskin, with a seal cloak over it to keep out the wet. He surveyed the scene grimly, standing at the brink of the pit and noting the absence. "How can he be gone?" he demanded. Kalameshli did not answer. Whatever thoughts snapped and danced within his mind did not show themselves on his face. Akrit looked up at the low, leaden sky, wondering if any trace of the old snake's scent might remain. "He was old! How far can he have got?" He stared at the handful of his people who had braved the elements and Kalameshli's wrath. "Get me every hunter fit to track! He can still be coiled up somewhere in the village!" "He's gone," the priest said softly, even as the spectators ran off to do their chief's bidding. "You don't know that! He was frail," Akrit argued. "How long could he last out there, with winter coming on? He'll stay by the warmth." "He wasn't alone," Kalameshli pronounced carefully. "What do you mean?" Akrit's eyes narrowed. "A rescue? Is there a whole nest of snakes in the wolf's shadow?" Abruptly, Kalameshli had stepped, his wolf form lean and strong, like the younger man he had once been, the chains of his years left behind. Without even glancing at Akrit, the beast went padding away, nose kept low, moving round the pit in widening circles. Akrit watched, wondering what the priest could possibly find, and yet the wolf was moving with a purpose, looking for something specific. A few of his hunters had arrived by then, including the reassuringly loyal presence of Smiles without teeth. Akrit had not even begun to think about what this meant, the theft of a sacrifice on the wolf's own day. As omens went, it could hardly be worse, and then he needed to think that with what that meant for his continuing rule over the winter runners, and where he would stand when the high chief died. None of it was good. It was events like this that could break even a strong man like Akrit Stone River. By then Kalameshli had stepped again, kneeling 30 yards from the pit, gesturing for Akrit to join him. He had found some tracks that the rain had filled, but not yet washed clear. Akrit himself might have missed them, hunter as he was, but the priest had known. Somehow he had divined the truth as though the wolf had breathed it into his ear. "Tiger," he stated, for Akrit's hearing only. For a moment, the chief was on the edge of the wrong conclusion, picturing some warband of the Shadow Eaters come down from the high places to attack their enemies. Would not stealing the wolf's meat be the sort of coward's revenge they would try? But then Kalameshli said simply, "A very small tiger," and Akrit finally understood. Even then, he did not want to believe it. He stepped to his wolf shape and rushed back up to his hall, headed inside and then up the shallow incline of the ladder to the store where Maniye had made her lair. She was gone, and so was some of her clutter. She was gone. He raced back to Kalameshli, springing back onto his human feet even as he reached him. I don't understand. She passed the testing. You tested her yourself. You made sure." He was perilously close to accusing the priest, stretching the bonds of their alliance. For his part, Kalameshli seemed more than ready to pull against him. "And you saw what I saw. There was nothing but the wolf in her after she finished the course." His words were hard like stones, quiet enough that nobody but Akrit could hear. "But then you called her in when you were in your cups, and told her far too much, all at once." "Because she was supposed to be ours then," Akrit hissed. But before he could say anything that might strain the space between them to breaking point, he held up his hands. You truly believe my daughter has taken the sacrifice and run off with him? A single sharp nod confirmed it. Akrit stared past him for a moment, feeling the wound tear within him. Not a wound of love, no. What he felt for the girl had never borne that name. A wound to his pride, though. For any hunter of the wolf, pride was a tender organ. Especially for a chief, for a man who would be chief of chiefs. Bad enough that Akrit had no sons to strengthen his name. Now even his daughter had turned against him. Who would follow a chief that could not rule his own blood? Seeing Kalameshli's derisive expression, he snapped. I'll send Smiles into the rough-back lands to take some of the boar. They've been left alone too long. The wolf won't go hungry. The priest's look showed how inadequate he thought the gesture would be. By then his hunters were up, no matter how hungover, and were ready to do his bidding. His first instinct was to simply send them out immediately to all quarters, without any plan. Even with the rain hammering down, her trail would be out there. Having his people charging back and forth like ants would make him more of a fool, though, and what did the girl know, truly? How long could she really survive in the wild and the wood, either as woman or wolf? But she was cunning, and cunning would lead her to where there were other people. There were villages of the boar and the deer, the small homes of farmers and herders, and there were trading posts of the coyote and the horse. With or without the old snake, she would make for somewhere that offered food and shelter. He delivered his orders, giving each man a destination. But pride wanted to limit word of this disgrace to the village, but such secrecy would only aid Maniye's escape. He must spread word of the girl, and let everyone know that her return would buy the gratitude of the chief of the winter runners, a rich commodity indeed. As he had promised Kalameshli, he dispatched Smiles without teeth and 2 warriors to attack the boar, because the wolf must have something to grind between his burning teeth, even if it was just thralls and farmers. The meal would not be as rich as they had both hoped. Neither the antlers of running deer, nor the skinny body of that foreign trespasser. But Akrit needed to husband all the goodwill he could manage. And last he turned to Broken Axe, who had been waiting patiently there, never mind the rain. The lean man was already dressed as if to set off into the wilds, cloaked against the weather and with a sack of food tucked under his belt. His cold, pale eyes met Akrit's stare in that manner unique to him, neither a challenger nor one ready to submit to another man's will, self-sufficient in all things, and yet a hunter and a tracker without peer. You know what has happened here? Because by now the word would be in the ears of every winter runner. Akrit had colored the tale in the ending, saying that the old snake had freed himself, through magic perhaps, and had enchanted this girl, stolen her away. The truth could look just as convincing when turned backwards and inside out. Broken Axe nodded. What he believed, or even if he cared enough to believe anything, stayed hidden behind his closed expression. Track them down, Akrit instructed him. Find the girl, bring her back here, alive. If the snake is with her... Akrit shrugged. Use your discretion. But I must have my daughter back. He almost said more, because, of course, Broken Axe would know why the girl was so important. He would remember the mother and Akrit's orders all those years ago. But no, perhaps some things were best left unsaid. The hunter weighed Akrit's words, looking away for a moment, and then back with a questioning glance. Whatever you ask, within reason, Akrit promised him. Perhaps more than you could ever think of asking for. Because this was still the most advantageous match for Maniye, once the girl was safely back. The girl would bind Broken Axe to Akrit's plans, just when he might have most need of such a man. Similarly, Axe would no doubt tame the wild cunning in her, even if he had to whip it out of the girl. At last, Broken Axe nodded, eyes still weighing Akrit and his gratitude against future need. A moment later, he had dropped to all fours and stepped into the shape of a gaunt, pale wolf, with dark hackles raised about his shoulders. Without a moment's hesitation, he was padding off with so much certainty that Akrit wondered if he had already scented the trail out before presenting himself there. And that concludes chapter number 7. So, Maniye took off and is encountering some problems with Hesprec, the snake priest. He's a little old for their journey. And now Akrit and Kalameshli are aware of her escape, and now Broken Axe is hot on her trail. So, see how that turns out in, I do believe, chapter 9. But that will be next week. Until then, we have chapter number 8, in which we go back to Venator and Asmander, see how they're doing. So, here's chapter number 8. After the hunt, only Venator would come close. Nobody needed to ask why Asmander did not step to his champion form for trivial purposes. The laughing men regarded him with that mix of awe and envy that he was used to, even from his own family. The shape he had been gifted with had no mute brothers in the world. The eyes of men had seen no other beasts that strode on those two sickle-clawed feet. There was something intangible, but undeniable that hung about that shape, deep and fierce and demanding of respect. If only this gift had fallen to Tecumander and not me. Asmander pictured his childhood friend, into whose young retinue old Asmand had schemed so hard to place his son. And it had worked. The two boys had been inseparable, no stronger comrades in mischief to be found in all the Sun River nation. When they had been young, it had not mattered that one was the son of a mid-ranking clan head, and the other was the son of the Kasra, the lord of all the riverlands. Had it been young Tecumander singled out by the gods for this honor, then a great many difficulties would never have arisen, and Asmander would not even now be heading towards the inhospitable north. Back at the Laughing Men village, the horse society had already bundled up its belongings, ready to depart. The intact return of their hetman and their two passengers was greeted with poorly hidden relief. They decamped to the river shortly afterwards, with the Malika and a party of her people coming to see them off. "Champion!" the Malika of the Laughing Men addressed him as the horse people loaded their canoes. "You must know, we hear much news of your nation here, by land and water." Asmander's manner suggested this topic of conversation was no great matter to him. "Indeed?" "You are not the first guests we have entertained here. Some were not heading north," she murmured in his ear. "Some came solely to seek my attention." He shrugged. "No doubt you showed them the same good hospitality with which you have honored us. Perhaps they were here to trade." "In their own way. They sought to trade for the use of our spears. It is an odd thing, but the wind tells me that there is strange weather in the Sun River Nation since the old Kasra died." "We are a complex people," he said. "Will you tell me of your response to them?" They could not be Tecumen's emissaries that had come to her. That much seemed plain. And if they had not come at the behest of Asmander's friend, they were likely his enemies. "Will you tell me of your prince?" Her breath was hot on his cheek, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. "He is a paragon of honor. From his youngest days he was marked to rule, by his own manner and by signs and portents noted by the priests. All who saw him knew him as he on whom the mask of the Kasra must surely fall," Asmander recited. "I think not," the Malika said softly. "For if it were as you say, then I would not have visitors from the south seeking the spears of the Laughing Men to come to Atalan." "And what did you tell them, these visitors?" Her yipping laugh was so loud and sudden in his ear that he started away from her with a curse, the champion's soul stirring briefly in him. "Champion, the Laughing Men do not take sides," the Malika declared. We wait, and we mark those who are weak, and those who have lived too long, and those whose time has come to pass on. Merely hope, then, that your prince is strong. Then she turned from him and gripped Venator by the arm, hard enough to make him bare his teeth. You old goat-eater! You are a villain! But her look was fond. If your young river lord is too soft a master, come back here. There is always work for a man to do. He twisted his arm from her grasp and sent her such a look, that of a man who truly does not know how to take the measure of the woman before him. Despite the grim conversation he had just endured, Asmander summoned a laugh from somewhere. Then the horse were pushing their boats out into the water, and it was time to leave. Just as Asmander swung himself over the side of the nearest vessel, another figure splashed out towards them. For a moment he thought it was the Malika herself, but it was a different woman of the Laughing Men, much younger, a sack and two spears in one hand, and a cloak of aurochs hide over her shoulder. The horse hetman made room for her in her own craft, with an ambiguous look towards the southerners. "Seems you impress them too much," Venator said, staring at the woman with suspicion. "Looks like they want to keep an eye on you." Asmander had half expected as much, given what the Malika had said. When he looked at the new arrival, he found her gaze on him already. She had her hair cropped close at the sides, with a tawny crest on top, and there were bars of red highlighting her cheekbones. Like so many of her fellows, she had a startlingly alive quality, a flame of the moment for which the weights of old history and future prospects that troubled Asmander's people simply did not exist. It made her beautiful, as fire was beautiful, even as it destroyed. The Plains tribes were becoming aware of changes in their southern neighbor. Some would seek to profit from it, others might be dragged in despite themselves, and the Laughing Men would always be ready to pick over the bones. Or these waters may yet grow calm, he reminded himself, not for the first time. There were no battle lines yet, no declarations of war, no accusations or claims. But Tecumen had gone to the fortress at Sokawan that secured control of the estuary islands, whilst in the capital of Atalan. But nothing will happen before the New Year's floods. Surely nobody is so eager to shed blood and break down walls. They will talk and talk, and the serpent's priests will meet, and nobody will lift their hand in anger. Not yet. It will not come to that. There will be bellowing and splashing and a show of teeth, that is all. The Sun River Nation cannot war against itself. That was his mission to the north, of course, the same that had sent other emissaries to the Laughing Men. He was going to fetch more teeth, better teeth. He was going to entice the iron wolves of the crown of the world to come and stand by Tecumen's side. Surely that would be enough. He felt the gaze of the hyena girl fixed on him keenly, as though she was waiting for him to die. It was the same when they drew up to the bank to make camp. When he looked for her, she was busy setting out her own blanket away from the horse society and the rest, laying out the brightly striped cloth with an air of great ritual. She was still watching him, though. When he turned his head away, her eyes were like points of faint pain in his mind. It was a game, he knew. She wanted to draw him to her. The Malika had tasked her with learning about the southern travelers, perhaps, or at least about their quest in the north. Probably the two of them would fight at some future time, her mission and his reaching their distant crossing point from which only one would walk away. So he smiled to himself and made a great point of ignoring her, and thus sought to draw her to him, to force the questions from her. It was an old game amongst the patient ones of the Riverlands. His father had played it like a master, using silence like a killing edge to savage his enemies, and his own family. It was one of Asmander's deepest buried secrets, the thing about his father. He himself was the dutiful son, the paragon of his clan, the boy who did everything that was expected of him. But the champion's soul did not like his father. It loved the Prince Tecuman as Asmander did, but his father, no. That fierce, proud soul bucked against the man's hand, bared its teeth at his orders. And who was Asmander to say that it was not right? It saw so many things more clearly than his human eyes could. And another smothered secret thought was just this. If I were not his son, would I like him? Or would I loathe him as a dangerous, ambitious creature? Just as well, I am his son then. And just as well he supports Tecumen, for I could not make that choice, not blood kin against bound brother. She says she's Sherry. Venator dropped down beside him heavily. Asmander closed his eyes. The delicate game that had been coming together between him and the girl was abruptly in ruins, and one more source of entertainment on the journey north was gone. You have no soul! I have a black teeth soul, Venator replied robustly. The Black Teeth were his tribe amongst the people of the dragon, one of three equally vicious and disreputable clans of villains. To Asmander's knowledge, he had abandoned any close loyalty to them long ago, but he was still proud of bearing the violent stigma of their blood. So what is this Shiri, and why do I care? I thought you were sweet on her, from the way you weren't looking at her, Venator leered. Oh, really? These things are known. Asmander's first son has a reputation, the pirate goaded. Not known this far into the plains, I hope. Asmander managed a wan grin. And no, not interested, save in what she wants from us. She says she's the Malika's daughter, Venator stated. Not sure if that's actual daughter, or just one of her tribe. Well, if she can bear your breath, she's all yours, Asmander assured him. Venator gave him a crooked look. Not likely. Lay the mother, then the daughter? That's inviting ill luck. His broad shoulders twitched. Besides, one woman of the Laughing Men is quite enough. Enough for a lifetime. This time Asmander laughed outright. Glancing over at the hyena girl, he caught her predatory stare, just for a moment. Sitting away from the fire, away from the dozen horse society travelers already sharing a skin of something and telling one of their circular and recursive stories, she seemed as estranged as he was, even though this was her land. The attack came 2 days later. The mechanics of it were simple. Two ropes strung across the course of the river at a narrow point, sagging low enough that two of the canoes had passed over the first without noticing it. Then the trap was sprung, and abruptly both lines were pulled tight, catching the lead pair of boats between them, and almost flipping the last craft over as the line sprang up between its bows. Then there were warriors leaping down from the east bank, brandishing spears and bows. The terrain here was rugged, the river grinding a canyon through the dry land that grew steeper the further north they traveled. The west bank rose in sheer cliffs, accessible only through occasional landslips or the odd path that had been painstakingly carved into the rock. The eastern shore was less severe, but still a ragged tumble of rock and scrub, sometimes rising to 10 feet over the water, sometimes closer to 20. The eroded, rocky ground offered plenty of hiding places, and in the first seconds of the attack, Asmander felt that the whole bank was suddenly transformed into leaping, whooping men and women. They were tall and long-limbed, some unarmored and wearing only cloaks and tunics, others with cuirasses made from strips of thick gray hide. Most of the men amongst them sported headdresses of feathers, stiffened hair and grass that surrounded their faces, standing out in a ragged mane on all sides like the rays of the sun. Their faces were painted with white darts, like teeth. The handful that had bows were already loosing arrows in the shallow arcs over the water. One of the horsemen in Asmander's boat was struck at once, the shaft piercing deep into his arm. Others were scrabbling for their own weapons or trying to shelter under the gunwales. The lead canoe had struck the forward rope and skewed off towards the bank, the eddy of the current taking it right towards the attackers, as had obviously been planned. The hyena girl, Shiri, was in that first boat, and Asmander saw her crouching there, one spear in her off hand, and one cocked back, ready to throw. "Shall we?" Asmander called to Venator. The pirate nodded. His face had gone hard as stone. A moment later he had stepped, from human to a great lizard coiled within the boat. Lunging over the side, he almost upset it entirely. Then he had vanished into the water, nothing to be seen of him but a sinuous wake. Some of the horse were now sending back arrows, using their deceptively small recurved bows that were supposed to be the best in the world. Asmander bunched himself and then dived over the side of the boat into the water, stepping even as the cool river hit him, so that what moved beneath the surface with a powerful thrashing of its tail was old Crocodile, the long, ridge-backed shape of the river lords. Instantly he was alive with new senses, feeling the liquid medium pulse and surge around him with every movement, scenting blood and fear, and letting the tremors and currents inform him. His whole body rippled with muscular ease, surging him forwards with all the speed he could muster, mastering the current that was trying to drag him away. His eyes broke the surface, seeing the confusion of movement that was the attackers. More than one of them had gone in ankle deep or more to snare the lead boat. His lunge was perfect, wholly unsuspected, his great jaws thrusting from the breaking water to clamp across the calf of one of the warriors there, filling the hungry void of his mouth with blood. A spasmodic twist of his tail and his yelling victim was dragged into the deep water. Here was where Asmander's mute brothers would hold the prey until it drowned, then tear it apart, working their jaws against each other's. He had no such desire or luxury of time, and so he wrenched himself sideways, spinning his body as if he was trying to tear off a mouthful of flesh and making a horrible ruin of the warrior's leg. A second later, he had released his hold, fighting his crocodile soul, which wanted only to slake its gluttony, and whipped himself back towards the shore. The river would finish what he had started with his prey. This time he did not ambush from the water's edge, but turned his burst of speed into a leap out of the bloody wash that had him stepping straight into his champion's form, landing on two clawed feet with a shrill shriek of challenge. The enemy nearest him had been about to cast a spear. She stepped as she saw him, dropping into the heavy body of a lioness. Her amber eyes were wide and her ears flattened back, and she retreated from his stalking shape, swiping at him with a paw. Asmander took a moment to take stock, despite the fierce need of his soul to seek battle. There was Venator's long, black-scaled body locked in a murderous embrace with a young lion, his jaws closed on the beast's throat, his hook-clawed feet sunk into its hide. On the other side, where the boat was, a handful of the horse were fighting savagely with spears and long-handled dagger axes. Two were down already, and then another stepped, rearing up as a stallion and bringing bronze-hard hooves down on the heads of the attackers. He heard a shrill cackle and caught sight of Shiri, a hyena snapping and dancing as she led on a lion almost twice her size. She seemed terribly outmatched, and yet the bigger beast's hide was bloodied, and she was always just outside its reach. Then she was a woman again, whipping her cloak across the great muzzle and then driving her spear towards it, bloodying the claws it put out to snare her. Asmander could hold himself back no longer. 3 steps and a leap took him into the midst of the band that was pressing in on the horsemen, ripping a claw down one woman's ribs and bowling over a couple more. Instantly he was surrounded by lions, snarling and baring fangs, but the horse took their chance, driving at their enemy with their long weapons, cutting themselves space. Asmander had fought the lion before, and knew them well. A big male cat was heavier and stronger than his champion form, but nowhere near as swift. Moreover, the lion were always courageous on the attack, far less so when forced to defend themselves. They liked easy conquests and were too wise to fight against the odds. With that in mind, Asmander unleashed a flurry of strikes, nothing that would kill or raise more than a scar. But he got a claw into all three of the beasts close to him, and they sprang away, hurt and startled. By then he had the horse backing him, and Sherry slunk in on one side with her teeth grinning red, whilst Venator was approaching along the waterline with a slow, insolent, tail-dragging pace. The lion raiders reformed part way up the bank, some as humans, some as beasts. They still outnumbered the travelers by more than 2 to 1, but the presence of Sherry and the two southerners was plainly an unwanted complication. Then one of them stepped forth, a man bigger than his fellows, his chest bare and gleaming like copper, hatched with scars and painted with thick white dagger blades. He wore no mane of grass, and his face seemed misshapen, heavy-jawed, and brutish. He had a short-hafted axe in each hand, the blades of chipped flint. A pair of the horse were getting their wounded on the boat as calmly as possible, making no sudden moves. Asmander stepped abruptly to Human to draw the lion's attention. Shiri followed him. He's... she started, but Asmander cut her off with a sharp nod. A lion champion this, no doubt of it. He could feel the presence of the man like a tangible thing, something more than the mere bulk of him could account for. It was an unlooked-for prize, to pit his soul against this man's. Asmander squared his shoulders, feeling within him that thrill of anticipation that was both his and not his. Then Venator had unfolded into his human shape as well. "This one's mine!" Asmander glanced at him. The pirate was grinning, just a little, showing his brown and yellow teeth. He was shorter than his opponent, broader at the shoulder, but surely more than 10 years older. "You're sure?" For answer, Venator stepped forwards, pointing the stone blade of his maret at the lion champion. "Hey, fat boy!" Shiri yelped in amusement, sitting back on her haunches. In an instant, the lion had dropped to all fours and stepped, undergoing a monstrous shift as his bulk bloated out and forwards. His cat shape was stub-tailed, heavy-shouldered. He was 1.5 times the size of the largest lion Asmander had seen, fangs like swords curving from his upper jaw. Every line of him demanded fear and awe. Here was a monster that lived only within the soul of the lion. No beast like this walked the earth. The champion roared, the sound rolling across the rocks like thunder. Everyone else held motionless as he padded forwards, his steps almost delicate. Venator stood waiting, still as stone. He had his tricks, though, did the old pirate. The first was that sudden shift of stature, from big man to the low-slung bulk of a lizard. Venator was moving even as the champion increased his pace, and, when his enemy pounced, he was ducking, lunging forwards into his reptile form as though he was a thrown spear. The whip of his tail raised a welt across the champion's ribs, and then they were both turning, the lion faster, Venator just fast enough. The champion smacked out with a paw, the claws skidding off his opponent's pebbly hide to leave a smear of blood. Venator's sharkskin coat lent 1,000 tiny blades to his lizard scales. Then the lion's terrible jaws were gaping wide, insanely wide, about to drive those killing teeth down into him. Venator writhed aside, taking a gash across the shoulder of that peeled even through his tough skin, and dragged his own regiment of fangs across the lion's foreleg, just as he twisted away. Then the two of them were circling, or at least the champion was circling, and Venator was mostly staying still, just shuffling round to keep facing his enemy. Blood welled sluggishly from his opened shoulder. The champion went for him again, a smooth transition from stalking to leaping that caught Asmander by surprise. The old pirate had been waiting for it, though, rearing up onto his hind legs and then abruptly becoming human, trying to vault over the swift bulk of his enemy. He almost made it, too, but the high crest of the lion's back knocked him aside, sprawling him on the ground. Asmander was aware of many eyes flicking towards him, wanting to know when he would intervene to save his companion. He wanted to. Moment to moment he wanted to. But it was not his place. Venator would have cursed him for it. Venator was up on one knee, breathing heavily under the yellow gaze of the champion. He drew the greenstone of his maret up to his mouth and licked its edge as though seeking the taste of blood there. He stood up slowly, watching the lion pace, weathering the fire of the champion's presence. He looked like a man waiting for execution. Then the champion was rushing down on him again, but 3 steps into his charge the lion stumbled, his wounded foreleg folding unexpectedly. Venator was on him immediately, seeming for a moment to be grappling the creature, and then he had brought the dense weight of his blade down across the lion's back and ribs with a single solid stroke. The champion yowled in pain, knocking Venator flat with a blow of his paw, but not following up, instead backing away, limping and favoring one side. For a moment he was a warrior again, staring at Venator in bafflement. "Why aren't you dead yet, old man?" Asmander knew that look well enough. Then they had both stepped back to their fighting shapes, but this time it was Venator who was advancing implacably, and the champion fell back, one uncertain step at a time. The venom in the lion's veins was not enough to kill, but the great beast's strength was being sapped moment to moment. He would need a quick victory over Venator, and yet, when courage was most needed, the man was failing. Asmander found himself silently urging the lion on, champion to champion, willing the man to stand and fight. "What would I do if I were he?" Of course, he would like to think that he would go on until the death. Was it really true, though? Surely every man's courage was a rope of uncertain length, hauled hand over hand out of clouded waters. Who knew how suddenly that rope's end would whip up into the air? Then the lion champion was a man again, standing impassively, staring at the black length of the dragon lizard before him. He closed his eyes, letting his axes fall, and then he had dropped to one knee, not so much submission as being able to stand any longer. A current of anguish and despair murmured through the lion raiders as they saw it. Venator regarded him, bluish tongue flicking. He took another lethargic step forwards. "Back!" Asmander told him. "Enough!" A shudder of annoyance rippled down the lizard's body. A fistful of threats came to Asmander, invocation of the powers his clan had gained over the defeated pirate, the oaths of fealty that had brought him his life. In the end, though, all he said was, "No doubt you will enjoy your fill of champion's blood, old man. Not today. Your chance will come." Venator was abruptly human again, staring back at him. Asmander's meaning was heard and understood. When he had won his name back from the first son of Asman, there would be a settling of scores. "These things are known," he growled, and Asmander nodded. The lion raiders were retreating back up the ragged rocks on the bank. One of the horse society was dead, 2 injured, but not in imminent danger. Venator moved his torn shoulder, wincing and feeling for the damage. "Let them see to it," Asmander advised. He thought the pirate would refuse, but then a tired expression came to Venator's eyes, and he nodded wearily. A familiar pressure came to Asmander then, and he looked about to find Shiri still sitting in the water's edge, but in her human form now. This time she did not look away. "You would have killed him, of course, or let Venator kill him," he observed to her. She shrugged. Seeing that the horse had brought all their boats to the shore and were cutting away the 2 ropes restricting the river, he abruptly sat down beside her. "How far has your mother sent you, laughing one?" "What makes you think I am sent?" Her stare was intrusive, like a prodding finger. "How far will you go, then? All the way to the cold?" "Wherever I wish, however far I care to." "And will you follow me?" he asked her. Her eyes flared wide. "Longmouth, you flatter yourself." and she was suddenly up and stalking over to the boats, leaving behind only Asmander and Venator's faint laughter. That concludes chapter number 8 of The Tiger and the Wolf. So, bit of a scrap happening out there in the desert. They were ambushed. The Horse Society, with Asmander and Venator in tow, as well as Shiri, the hyena girl, were ambushed by lions, and the fight didn't go so well for the lions. They thought they had the advantage, but Venator and Asmander are quite strong, and Shiri, as it turns out, is a very capable warrior. So, yeah, make sure to tune in again next week, same time, same place, Friday at noon, to find out what happens in the next couple of chapters of The Tiger and the Wolf. Look forward to seeing you then. Until then, enjoy your weekend. Bye now.